on the screen the three modes, the three fundamental modes of any vibration: longitudinal, transverse being 90 degrees, and then a Raleigh wave rotating at 90 degrees to those two. You can't have one without the other two. It's physically impossible. They are intertwined components, one within the other. In the electromagnetic scale of forces, if you start at 1 hertz down here and you double your frequency every octave on up, as you go through the octaves, I believe it's at the 21st octave you get a mode shift. So it goes from predominance to the longitudinal to predominance to the transverse. And then as you go higher than that, the predominance changes again, probably to the Raleigh. Now, KELEA alluded to these shifts in modes according to frequency, but we haven't had them verified yet. But I believe they are there. That would describe in part the difference between sound that we hear and light that we see. Moving along, part of that, what brought this up was how the sun can heat the Earth through 93 million miles of vacuum. KELEA maintained that a force called the polar forces, the celestial triune forces coming from the sun, are balanced in a harmonic fashion. In other words, they're intertwined together concordantly, just as you would a rope that has 3 braids to it. You twist this rope together and you can't see any of the 3 braids until you twist this rope backwards. And then you can start to see the 3 modes of vibration inherent in the one mode, the one vibration. And accordingly, this is kind of like the scalar stuff that you're hearing about now, where you have a potential, but you don't have anything evident. You can't see it. You can't measure it, but it's there. You got all this potential. Well, as this energy travels from the sun, intertwined together harmonically, as it is balanced, as we talked before, there is no manifestation of this energy. When you're in balance, when you're in harmony, there is no outer manifestation. You can't sense it, you can't measure it, you can't do anything with it, but it is there. And that's another answer to some of the subtle energy business. Energy is all around us in infinite quantities, but it is harmonically bound together in a triune polar flow. Now, if we take a generator that is composed primarily of magnets, now you got a bunch of copper wire in them, and you twist the magnetic currents against each other, you're going to split this triune flow apart. And if we're real clever, we'll put 2 little copper wires down each side, and the electrical current will rush down these wires. But it will only rush down those wires if it can see a place where it can get back together where it came from. So the spark at the end of a wire is not electricity that's been generated. It's electricity that's trying to get back to where it came from. It seeks that place of balance. It will always seek that place of balance. And the spark is the energy going back into a state of balance where it disappears again. So it's not used up. It just gets infolded. It becomes re-emerged where it came from. So if we got this energy streaming from the sun, it is of a given frequency component, frequency range, a waveform. When it strikes a molecule or an atom, which is vibrating, the atom and molecules vibrate at different frequencies. Those frequencies combine with the frequencies of the radiant energy from the sun and demodulates it to a lower frequency range to where we can see it. It splits it apart. That is called refraction. That's why you can't see light. You can see me and I can see you, but you can't see anything between us. You can't see light. So that's the undifferentiated light of the ancients. That's the undifferentiated whole white light. When it strikes a molecule or an atom, it refracts, splits it into various subtle ranges of frequencies, and then we get the rainbow. And that explains how all that stuff happened. So we've got this current coming from the sun. KELEA said it was magnetic, electrical, and gravity, or gravitic as they call it. And this, I got a chart here. These rays from the sun are called actinic rays. It's an ancient term. It was used quite predominantly in the 1800s because these guys are all investigating the whys and wherefores. A funny thing about spheres will focalize impacting energy to their centers. People will do the same thing. If we think of people as centralized vibrating forces, we tend to absorb things that impact to us, whether it's a sound or somebody speaking or whatever. We tend to bring it to ourselves. We'll take that into ourselves eternally, like a piece of knowledge, like I'm conveying to you, and then you'll chew it up or whatever, and then you'll re-radiate it back out to somebody else. You'll tell them about different things that you learned. So the sun and the planets all do the same thing, only they do it just a little bit different. So the energy radiating from the sun, first it picks it up from the grand central sun of the universe, and then it'll contract it to itself, focalize it to its center, and then re-radiate it back out to the Earth, and then the Earth will do that again, and each molecule on the Earth does the same thing. Now there is a law in philosophical physics, the natural philosophy of the 1800s, to which KELEA said was the one fundamental law in the universe, to which all other laws are subservient. And it's called the law of assimilation, the cosmical law of assimilation. And that's what you're seeing in operation here. The contracting inward, the focalizing, the bringing inward, and then the re-radiating back out. Everything else is subservient to that phenomenon. So we have centers, infinitely tiny centers, which aren't really there materially speaking, but it is about these centers which coalesce or form or aggregate these other forces and become an integral unit of itself. So that's where each one of us humans are too. This neutral center of us is our soul, evidenced through the solar plexus, etc., etc., etc. In the martial arts, they teach us that's where the center is, and we try and centralize our forces, our attention, our will, and become very quiet and very still. The natural attributes of that neutral center is that, quietness. So the center volume of any given sphere or entity is 1/3 of the volume of that sphere is a neutral zone. On the outer side, we got the peripheral forces, as we spoke before. The male forces, the radiating forces, tend to seek the outside peripheral of it, and the female forces towards the centers. Without the neutral center in there, male and female forces, the positive and negative forces, cannot associate properly. I'll give you a perfect example, analogy in human activity. And I really like this analogy. It's really kind of neat. We've all seen couples ice skating, especially in the Olympics. A very, very beautiful sight. Here's a male and female, man and woman, doing an extraordinarily beautiful, harmonious thing. So we've got the male and the female acting in concert to create a concordant, harmonious spectacle. The neutral is etheric. The neutral is their ideal. What is it they are trying to attain? If they have the same ideal, the same etheric, neutral governing principle, then you've got this concordance, this harmony of motion and activity. It's when that ideal is lost that you got some of the problems we see today. They don't have a common ideal. So the neutral is both positive and negative. It can be either. It can become predominantly positive, predominantly male, or vice versa, female. So the neutral can become both. And yet it is one of the greatest enigmas of this KELEA stuff. What exactly is this neutral thing? So we've got the energy coming in from the sun, attracted towards the center of the earth, going into this neutral zone and being converted. It's like platinum does in the chemical industry. Platinum converts elements from one to another, and yet it itself remains the same, unchanged. This is starting to sound like the old philosopher's stone of the ancient times. So the platinum embodies the neutral forces, the neutral force, or the neutral condition, I think we'd rather say. And in the old books, like Genesis, for instance, if we look at Genesis from a vibratory standpoint, it becomes like a tech manual. It says how the etheric, the infinite energy levels, the void, remember how we talked about all the energy was in the void, there was God, that was everything, is held latent in that void. And how that became demodulated lower and lower and lower frequencies by stages, as it would be in music, to become male and female forces, and then the neutral force, which would be God in the center of Adam and Eve. And it's kind of neat when you start looking at some of this ancient literature from these fundamental universal principles. Those guys knew what they were talking about. But if you transport yourself back 2,000 years ago, there was no English word for vibration. There was no English word for electricity or any of these things. So they had to convey it to us in allegorical form or metaphors or whatever to get the essence or the insight to what they were trying to tell us. And the Masons had it, and the Rosicrucians had it, and the Indians, Vedas, and all those people had all this stuff. And all we're doing is rediscovering something that's been there all this time. Are there any questions? Somebody had a question about water.
Yeah, I was reading some KELEA material, and it mentioned an interesting experiment where you take a sound vibration of around 40,000 cycles per second, which you could generate, say, by a piezo ceramic disc, and put it in or near a cup of water. It'll start to vibrate, and if you increase the power enough, it'll turn into pure energy. Could you explain something about that?
Sure, yeah. In some of this literature that we have, it's reported that John KELEA, like in this particular motor, you could take water and vibrate it at a given frequency, and it would disassociate the water. Well, that's kind of neat. In one of the articles, it mentions that he found that the frequency of 42,800 cycles per second would be sufficient to disassociate water. Disassociate means break water into water vapor. So you break the large molecule of water into smaller molecules of water vapor. And in my effort to figure out exactly what was going on, and this was back in the beginning, I don't think he used a pure mechanical vibration. You're talking about piezoelectric. Yeah, that works. If you can go down to Walmart or Kmart and you can buy an ultrasonic humidifier. Here is sound in the high frequency ranges breaking water into water vapor. And you can buy it off the shelf today. 100 years ago, there was no knowledge of ultrasonics. Ultrasonics didn't become a subject until the 30s, 1930s, 50 years after KELEA did his work. In my own effort, I have not been able to convince myself that 42,800 is a significant frequency, except maybe if we could take water and pulsate it, as this motor does. Just take the whole volume of water and start to do this to it, 42,800 times a second. I think we would see a dramatic disassociation of that water. If you could pull a vacuum on it that fast and compress it that quickly, this thing would actually explode. I'm pretty sure that's what would happen. Now, I did take an ultrasonic humidifier apart, and I pulled out the piezoelectric device, and we tried to do an analysis on the frequencies coming out of this thing so we could, get some idea of what was going on. The only piezoelectric transducers, little crystals. There's a lot of talk about crystals around here, but technically speaking, we got this little crystal, barium titanate usually. If you put a current into it, it will expand or contract. And so you put a current in there the many times you want it to expand and contract, and this thing will do it. However, it creates many, 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 many modes of vibration. There are many frequencies coming out of this transducer. So we need to identify the fundamental. We were not able, with the crummy equipment we had, to identify the fundamental of this crystal. And I also understand that as the frequencies change, use higher or lower frequencies, you get different fundamentals and you get different modes. So we were not able to analyze this crystal. We did learn, however, that they were using a lot of power. They were putting a lot of power through this crystal. And if you look at some of KELEA's stuff, he didn't use power like that. Where where we use power today with the old sledgehammer male approach, let's just put more power in it to get an effect. He used art, and he tuned these machines as though they were musical instruments, which is what they were. He would fine-tune every component, every piece of the machine until it sounded as though it were a musical instrument. And then he could zero in on these various frequencies. So whatever the chord was that disassociated water, he built that into his machines, and he could just sound a harmonica or whatever, and bingo, he would have all this etheric vapor. That, by the way, if you go from solid or liquid or water, which is large molecules, down to water vapor, which is smaller molecules, and then you break that down, you get into KELEA's etheric vapor. And this etheric vapor has extraordinary properties. And that's how he derived from it. That is how he created his etheric vapors. It was through this sound operating on water. And he took it down 8 levels. If anyone could replicate those types of experiments and get that etheric vapor to where they could use it, I think we would find a revolution in our technology today, and a veritable revolution in what we could do. I have a question in the back.
Yes. Have you seen Andrija Puharich's paper on using these methods to disassociate water for fuel?
Yes, I have. Puharich, quite a character, this Andrija Puharich. He designed and patented and built an acoustic disassociating device that was made of special ceramic material. They put water into it. I don't know exactly how it all worked. This water would disassociate to the hydrogen-oxygen level, and he made an attempt to use the hydrogen as a fuel. It was hydrogen on-demand device. Quite extraordinary. This was 12, 15 years ago that he did this. I don't think anything ever became of it. I think someone could probably dig that out and really do something with it. Do you have a question?
It sounds like there might be some correlation with what's going on here and what Hahnemann did to get the homeopathic remedies to be as vital as they were when there was less and less of what there was. Is it when, do you know?
Yeah, good question. Really good question. I got to say something first. This stuff is so simple. You know, we tend to confuse everything. That's what we want to do. If it's not difficult and hard to understand, there's probably nothing to it. That's what they teach us in school. The higher you go in your grades, the tougher it gets, and then you get your degree because you went through all this agony to learn this thing so that you can charge money for it. I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's true at all. I think it's exactly the opposite. If we could simplify and we could see clearly with our hearts, then all the stuff becomes real simple. And it's so simple. You meet these people, practitioners of these various things like homeopathy and the hands and all this kind of stuff, and you say, where's the technology? Where's the science? And yet they're curing people right and left. We're creating major effects in people's lives. This question that she has about homeopathic function. What's going on in this room is a perfect demonstration of the homeopathic phenomenon. You guys are a bunch of molecules in the water. I am a single molecule of something else. And I'm emitting or radiating a given frequency, range, or component, or complex of information to you. When we break up and we go out in the halls and you return to your lives and I return to mine, you're all going to have a piece of what I gave you, and you're going to resonate to that. Some of you are going to take it to levels I never dreamed of. Some of you are going to take it into fields I never thought about or didn't have time or couldn't get into. And that's the basic principle behind it. It's a sympathetic transmission of like to like, and it evokes a response in the so-called isolated system. That's what's happening here, only on a much higher level. This is happening on the etheric and mind level. So the homeopathic thing is just that, and nothing more than that. It's very, very, very simple. Did that answer your question? I can't see. I got this light here in my face. Two other things here. We get back to a basic principle. Difference between a vibration and an oscillation. Vibration is the movement of an atom within inside itself. It's like the subatomic particles that compose an atom are vibrating. That's the vibration of the atom. But the atom may be oscillating, bouncing into other atoms. That's an oscillation. It's like people dancing. Inside they got this real neat vibration, and the outer manifestation of it is the oscillation. So they are different. They are fundamentally different. We got any more questions on some of this?
Are you familiar with the work of Rudolf Steiner?
Yes.
Because Steiner, I guess through clairvoyant insights, whatever, or also natural observation, arrived to the conclusion that the life force expresses its flow in vortexes. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could correlate that to KELE, if there was an analogy somehow.
Yes, there is. KELE made a statement to the same effect. He said all force manifests in vortex motion. And at first glimpse, when you first look at that statement, you say, well, that's absurd because lasers don't vortex and all this other kind of stuff. And you got to remember that the information we have on KELE is scraps, bits and pieces that we found in newspaper articles, magazine articles. And so we got to take these little scraps and use a little bit of deduction and whatnot and try and figure out in what context was this thing said. And I think that the answer to that goes back to this original drawing. That we can't have any vibration without all three modes. And if that's the case, then he's correct. That we can't have any manifestation of any kind of energy unless we got the vortex at the same time. So we may have a radiant type phenomena going on, but it's going to cause a rotation. And I've got another thing here that shows how the rotation can come about. This reflects wave motion in water. If you had a stick sitting on the water and the water is got a wave motion in the water, the stick doesn't go anywhere. It just goes up and down, up and down, up and down. The same thing with the atom or the molecules of the water itself. It looks like the molecules of the water are moving along with the wave front, but that's not true. The molecules of the water are actually rotating. So here we've got a polarization effect causing rotation again. When we've got compression on the water, we get a rise in the water altitude, which is the wave that we see, but right next to it we have a decrease in the pressure, which is the trough of the wave. So we've got positive and negative forces combining together to create rotation of the particles that make the water up. So that's about the best I can do with that statement. Yeah, Steiner also went on to say in 1913, in a previously unpublished lecture that they translated just recently, a few years ago, that the science of the future would be based on sympathetic vibration. So he was very well aware of Kele's work at that time. This is just to demonstrate some of the modern morphology ideas on how the molecules and atoms are put together. The molecules made of atoms are made of electrons are made of photons, and photons are made out of quarks. That's exactly Kele's definition. 20 years before they admitted an electron existed.
So would you say that Kele was clairvoyant?
He was definitely exceedingly very clairvoyant. I mean, how else would this man or any man get the knowledge that he had? There's just no explanation for it. He took a little bit of science, a little bit of mathematics, and he far exceeded anything we can even dream of today, much less do it. We're just struggling. We're just struggling along. Any more questions on some things? Getting back to the mind control machines, I want to be skipping around now because I kind of lose my place here a little bit. Mind control machines. We've got radionic machines that are nothing other than drawings on a piece of paper, and we can get effects on these devices. What's going on? You know, how can we treat a photograph and have an effect take place miles away from the source? You know, what's the principle here? What's happening? If we go back to what KELEA was saying about the brain being an acoustic resonator. Now, acoustics, a sound wave isn't just something we can hear. A sound wave can exist at any frequency. A sound wave is a compression wave, okay, compression rarefaction. So we can go up to these infinitely high levels of frequencies in the gamma range frequencies, light frequencies, and we still maintain compression rarefaction with many, very exceedingly high frequencies. The brain, the physical gray matter of the brain with its convolutions and its really neat shape that it has, if we look at it as an acoustic resonator, we say, okay, well, we got this thing, and every brain is different. It's physically different. Each brain, therefore, would have a unique collection of frequencies associated with it. So if we could write those down, we would write them as a musical notation. So the frequency is not really that important, but we would have a unique collection of notes that this particular brain that we're looking at would resonate to and vibrate to. Now, when we look at numbers, like if we looked at this number 16, now this is a little bit, I want to give you a little exercise here. All this is two squiggles on a piece of paper. I made one squiggle down and one has got a curly Q on it. If we weren't previously conditioned to read this as 16, what would we see? We would see two squiggles. That's all we would see. It would mean nothing to us. If you can set yourself aside from your previous conditioning and look at that as a symbol, this is a symbol. When we perceive it with our minds, with our eye and into our mind's eye, certain parts of the brain are activated. Certain parts of the brain are excited in a certain way because of the particular configuration that this is. If we saw this squiggle down here, we would get a different type of excitement. A different thing would take place within the physical brain. So when KELEA made his machinery, and he could go over to the wall and draw a symbol on the wall and have the motor start, what he was doing was exciting those particular places within the brain to emit a particular chord of frequencies. It's like tuning a radio, or sounding a trumpet, or any other kind of acoustical device. If you excite that device, you're going to get a certain particular chord of frequencies. And if his motor was tuned to those frequencies, it would react. That's why our bodies react the way they react. According to KELEA's philosophy, it is the etheric currents going through the body on these high levels, in tune with the aspects, with the pieces and the materiality that is our hand. We have that sympathetic connection, so there's a sympathetic stream of vibrations going down through the materiality of your body. And if you happen to be holding a spoon just right, it will do what you want it to do. So we have this connection. There is this innate connection between the brain and the mind and the etheric currents and the materiality of the realm that we live in. Question over here.
How can you consciously tune into that vibration as far as with your mind and other objects? I mean, from my studies, I understand that one, there has to be a sincerity from a positive standpoint, or it will be very limited. But how can you fine-tune yourself to that level?
Okay. Keep going back to this chart. That chart and this other chart are absolutely fundamental to understanding this. Earlier we showed how mind is a particle. Mind energy is this realm of superfine particles, energetic particles that pervade the entire universe. So that is the mind field, if you want to call it that. And our brains, as resonators, are also transducers through the endocrine system, the chakra system, to transduce the lower energies to these higher levels of energies. Through this, what I call the Jacob's ladder, you go down the real low frequencies of the brain, up through the really high frequencies of the mind. Okay, so there's this ladder going up and down. If this is true, if all matter is permeated with mind, and ultimately that's what it's composed of, is mind, then we are mind. And by tuning in our brain, and the way we would do that, we kind of hit along this a little bit earlier, by bringing the body, the mind, the emotions into a state of quietness. Because we just got done saying that the inharmonic, the discordance, is what causes motion. And the will, in my viewpoint, studying all this, the will is the most inharmonic force in the universe. The will causes motion and activity. We think we want to get up and go do something, we get up and go do it. We will to do things, we cause things to happen. So you quiet the will, you quiet the mind, you quiet the body, breathe in and out slowly, and you build that peace and quiet within yourself, allowing the inharmonic currents, the inharmonic effects, to just subside. You know, don't push them, don't force them, because that in itself is inharmonic. So you just allow the harmony to come forward, to grow and to become one with your neutral center, which is your soul. Because the synonym for sympathy is as one. So when things are sympathetic, they are as one. They are in love. They're the same, one and the same. So when you become as one with that neutral center, then that's when the cosmic illumination happens. That's when you see all these things, the brilliant lights and the tremendous inflow of information by becoming one with. Does that make sense?
When I used to think about becoming in one with a certain object or a thing, like an animal, I used to think, when you're talking about not using your will or your brain, I used to think at that animal, and now I think with that animal, because it is being coercive to those elements when you're trying to do any kind of a control thing. It's the same thing with seeing auras. The more you think about it, the less you can see it oftentimes. Where if you let go, you can't always see it, but it will start to come in. So I can understand exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Or let go, let God, or whatever it might be.
Become one with. There's a good analogy in spoon bending. Some guy came over to the house one day and he was bending spoons, and we got all interested in it and pursued that a little bit. And if you haven't learned how to bend a spoon and actually done it, do it. It is one of the most amazing experiences you can have. In the olden days, and anything that happened before today is the olden days, we considered mind over matter. You know, we could do telekinesis and all that stuff, mind over matter. Well, that's the male approach. Take the female approach. It's mind in matter. That's the difference. Because if you can use your Zen approach, like you're talking, and just approach these things and allow the mind to flow and become one with the spoon or whatever it is you're dealing with, it'll do what you want. Because while you're doing that, you're asking permission to approach it, you're asking permission to associate with it, you know, that type of mental attitude. And that's the way it works. It's really neat. So the connecting link is these higher levels. You go up the Jacob's ladder to these infinitely high levels, you can cross over. Once you reach that mind level, the 8th level, everything is connected to everything else. And the connection is mind. It's not, you know, it's nothing other than mind. And mind and sympathy, or sympathetic flows of the mind energy, what is that but love? So everything in the universe is connected by love, through love, with love. And once you've done that, when you become one with this spoon, and it bends for you, you get this tremendously, I get this tremendously giggly feeling. It's like the laughing Buddha or something. You get this incredible joy. Not that you're bending the spoon, but because you're experiencing oneness with something other than yourself. It's really neat. It's a really neat experience. If you haven't learned it, try it until you get it, because it's really something neat. Some of the other things, we'll go into basic principles of music here a little bit. You don't need a whole lot. It's not going to be very difficult. First and foremost is relativity. Not Einstein's relativity, although he was touching all over this thing, but relativity meaning one thing has a value as opposed to another thing having another value. Each individual is a sacred individual, integral unto themselves. And this is part of what's wrong with society. We treat everybody as numbers, but they're not numbers. You know, a leaf on a tree is a whole leaf. It was created as a leaf. That leaf has substance, has existence, and it has a certain amount of sacredness that it was created by, these forces. So it may be smaller or slightly deformed or whatever, but it is still a leaf, integral unto itself. Each of us are the same ways. We can't lump people together. If we've got a musical note, let's say that's C, which I think it is, not being an expert in music. In Pythagorean, scale, this can be either 256 or 512, whatever you want it to be, it doesn't matter. But in a Pythagorean scale, this is considered, we'll just call it 512. Okay, that's the frequency or cycles per second of this musical note. If we go up to the next octave of it, that doubles the frequency. If we've got other notes here and anywhere along here, I don't have them at the tip of my tongue, so it doesn't matter. This is kind of like an algebra shorthand. Most of us in this room know something about algebra. You say A equals 512 and 2A equals 1024. It's that simple. So no matter what we do to these numbers, the relationship stays the same. A is, or in this case, C is always C, D is always D, or F and G are always F and G. And what constitutes those as notes is their ratio one to another. So a ratio would be so we've got, if we divided this out, it would be 2 to 1, and it's always expressed like this. So the ratios are always exact. And a real good example of this, might not be that good, but an example of this is the number for pi. Back in the old days, in fact, even to this day, the Masons teach about this thing called squaring the circle. And it's a mathematical problem. People try and deal with it. How can you square a circle? All the mathematicians who've looked at it say you can't square a circle. It is not physically possible to do that. However, that's because they're comparing apples and oranges, is why they can't do it. The circumference is not the same thing as a radius. And you can't divide one into the other because they're not the same thing. They're two different things. And we found out there, in the 1860s, a man named John Parker, a mathematician, squared the circle, wrote a book on it called Quadrature of the Circle. It's extraordinary work. We've republished it. An engineer friend of mine took that book and rewrote it so that we could all understand it, what was going on. And we found out that the value for pi is wrong in the 6th decimal place. You start digging around this old science books and you start finding out a lot of stuff we accept as truth just might not be exactly what we think it is. I might have these numbers a little bit messed up. I think that's the right ratio, but I have to look it up. These are the numbers we came out with. Circumference is this many parts and radius is this many parts. If you divide that into that, you get pi but it's a little bit different beginning in the 6th decimal place. And as you square the circle and you work with these numbers, you're always working with whole numbers. You cannot work with decimals. Decimals, if there was ever a Satan on this earth, he brought decimals down to us. I think it was the French and Napoleon, actually, who did that. But if you maintain whole numbers in ratios, you can't go wrong because there are whole leaves, there aren't fractions of leaves. There's no such thing as a 0.9 pregnancy. You're either or you're not. Same thing with circles. A circumference is a circumference, and a radius is a radius, and the two can't be divided into each other. They're opposites to each other. Maintain this as the ratio. So ratios are everything. So you get down into this, you say, well, if a frequency was the tooth on a comb, and the interval between the notes was the space between the teeth, which is more important, the teeth on the comb or the space between the teeth, which doesn't really exist. And you got to say that they both have to be there, or you have neither. It's like two sides of a coin. So we've got the male vibration radiating going out, and we've got the female space in between them that holds it together, gives it range and definition. And these things are analogous to human life. You just think about it a little bit. They all fit. So we've got to maintain a ratio and relativity. So we can change this number to anything we want. Doesn't matter. Because as long as we maintain a ratio, 2 to 1 in this case, then no matter what that is, it's always half, and that's always twice of that. And the other notes are always the same. It's 3 to 4 and 5 to 6, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when you get into music. But the basic thing you want to understand is, like some guys used to say, well, what frequency breaks down water? I say, well, it's not that simple. Because we don't know what he was vibrating. And that's all important because of the multiple waveforms that are created in any given vibrating thing. So we go back to this, keeping in mind the thing of relativity. So it doesn't matter what this fundamental tone is. This is your fundamental. As long as you maintain these ratios and numbers, they will always stay the same in relation to each other. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. Any questions on that? Relativity. And say something about Einstein. I don't really know what happened in those days, but Einstein published his paper in 1905, I think it was. If you go back in the old literature, the old scientific literature, you'll see direct references to the theory of relativity in the 1860s and the 1870s. And all that Einstein did was apparently read these old books, rewrote it into a form that was conventional for 1905, and then he got a lot of press. They didn't accept him anyway for 30 years. So, and I found that in my research, if you want to know what's going on, and if you really want to understand physics or music or sound or any of this stuff, you got to go prior to 1900. Somehow or for some reason, the books and the subjects that were written about since the 1900s do not contain this old stuff. You have to go back to 1895 and previous. Those guys did extraordinary work, absolutely mind-boggling research what they did. Tyndall and Helmholtz and KELEA and Tesla, that's when they did all the great work. Something happened, 1895, 1900, that gave us all this garbage that we have today. You got to go back to the basic principles and the basic science in the early days. That's why on my book table you'll find reprints of a lot of these old books. The ones I found to be valuable, I've tried to reprint them to make them available so you don't have to spend years finding them like I did. And I also took some of these things I'm telling you and rewrote them into a simpler manual, and I call it Sympathetic Vibratory Physics Level 1, which are these basic principles, because there is no book that contains them that I've found in such a form that we can understand them today in today's terminology. There was another little thing. To give you a prime example, in this old literature I kept running into references to positive, and negative, negative vibrations. And what are these people talking about? And You know, positive vibration radiates out and a negative contracts to the center. And one day I was fiddling around with pendulums and I figured it out, and it's really simple. And you got to keep this in mind when you're reading this old literature. If we take a pendulum and it swings out, we're going to divide this thing. This side over here is positive and this side over here is negative. The principle of duality has to be preserved in everything that we do. So when it swings out this way, it's a positive stroke on the positive side. So this is a positive phase. So we'll just put P in here instead of writing it all out. When it starts to stroke back, this is a positive negative phase. Coming over here, we've got a negative positive because it's on the negative side, moving outward, radiating outward. And then when it goes back in, we've got the negative phase. So these old guys, not all of them did this because they varied. Some of these did it different. When they said 42,800, they were probably saying 84,400. Because to them, this pendulum swing, which we regard today as a single vibration, was two vibrations. And when you think about it, when it expands out and contracts as a vibration, expands and contracts, that's one vibration. Only it's the opposite phase of the next vibration, which is expands out and contracts this way. So it's really neat. These guys had a beautiful inherent insight into some of these things in the old days. But we've become so simplistic in our technology that, you know, we hit or miss it. We got lots of power and energy. We can put lots of energy in a system and make it do what we want. But in those days, they didn't have that. They had to use art. And when you're building a musical instrument, you got to use art to get the sound out of it when you just blow in or strike it. Subtle energies in, major effects out. And you can only do that through art, which is right brain. Any questions on that one? Question over here.
Should the numbers on the left be reversed? Negative on the bottom?
Yeah, you could do that. Sure. You could do that. I just wrote them over no particular location.
I'm not trying to be too technical here, but the one on the negative side, as it swings out, the bottom one, would that be negative?
Right. Yeah.
Negative coming in because the negative side is contracting. It's a contractile force, the attractive force towards the center. Negative attracts to the center. Positive goes out. So when it goes out, it's positive. When it goes out, it's positive.
Okay, I understand. All right, thanks for clarifying.
Okay. About running out of things here. Need some questions. Here's a good one. This is some work I did in 88, 87, 88, whatever. I was trying to figure out how to determine a keynote, a person's keynote, and do it empirically so that we know what we're talking about. We're just not dreaming stuff up. And there's a lot in this chart. Basically, we start out here in the key of C, and going around this direction, you can see how the notes extend away from the center on this side, and then they contract back towards the beginning point again. If we assume that the Earth goes around the Sun, and we call this March 21st, at the beginning point, which is the beginning of the cycle of the Earth around the Sun, not January 1st, March 21st, goes around the Sun all the way back around back to March 20th, then we could say that any time period, if we divide, I got this divided into 14 sections instead of 12, and there's a good reason for that. In conventional music, there are 7 whole notes. And then there's 5 half notes, which are the sharps and the flats. On the piano keyboard, the white notes are the 7 notes, and the black keys are the half tones. That gives us 12. That's where the zodiac got his 12 signs from, dividing a whole into 7 harmonious parts. That's the octave of music. However, if we take music theory into account, in certain regards, every key has to have its opposite key. So we got 7 basic keys, 7 basic tones. We've got 7 basic halftones, which gives us 14. So I was trying to preserve the principle of duality in this chart when I put it together. Now there are 12 keys that we can create music in. There are also 2 other keys which happen to be the same as 2 of the others. So they only use 12, which is fine. But mathematically there's 14, 2 being duplicates of 2 others. So I laid out the 14 on here. And it works. It really does work. I developed this chart to build a wind chime tuned to an individual person. So I could determine what their keynote was, and then I could derive all the other notes that would go into conformity with the planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Question, I think Henry's got.
I just, the astronomers have been attacking the astrologers recently, and one of the evidence that they use to back up as opposed to the fraudulence of astrology is that there's 13 signs rather than 12. You know, astronomers got another sign. I forget the name of it right now, but they could very well be a more balanced chart with 14, as you're saying here right now. And also, I like your comments on how do you think Walter Russell's stuff fits in this. Does Walter Russell's stuff match what you're talking about here very well from your point of view?
Yeah, I haven't read a whole lot of Walter's stuff. What I have read matches almost exactly. Tim and I were going to get together. In fact, we've reiterated our agreement to get together and write a treatise on comparing Russell and KELEA together. We haven't just had time to do that. The other question about Tim Binder. The other question about 13 versus 12 and 14 and 64 and everything else. For every music theory book written, you got a different theory. And it is incredibly unknown, you know. And I think, I don't know what the answer is. You know, you look at one system and then we got 12 notes and you say, well, the next note's 13. That's the first note of the next octave instead of 7 and 8. Or, you know, where does this 13 come from? Where does this 7 come from? Where do all these things come from? And you can go to India and you get a 64-note octave. So that, I think somewhere in this murkiness of musical theory, the principles of 1 becoming 3, which doubles, and then you got the 7, and how all that evolves. It's like Genesis, you know, it starts with 1 and then goes into 6 and 7. You got 3 octaves. It happens 3 times in Genesis. So we have all these different, there's a fundamental thing here, and I've said for years and years and years, that once we resolve this question of how these numbers evolve from the 1 number, using these natural principles, universal principles, we're going to answer a lot of things when that happens, and we're getting kind of close to it. I have a question there.
Can you walk through an example of how you would find a person's musical note on that?
Sure.
Just use a person.
If we use conventional technology to determine a keynote, you know, how they do that is they take an object and they zap frequencies at it until it responds in a resonant mode, until it starts to resonate. And then we know what its resonant frequencies are. You can't really do that with a human being and expect them to survive. So thinking at it from a reverse angle, kind of like this motor over here, we say, well, gee, you know, a human being comes into existence in tune with the universe at the time they're born. The physical organism has to be in tune with the natural forces for it to come into existence, or it probably couldn't. I'm going to take that as a given, that it has to be in tune with the universal forces. If that's true, then it's real simple. We get an astrological chart, throw away the astrology part, keep the astronomy part, say where was the Earth in relation to the Sun when this person was born? And that's mathematics. Nobody can argue with that. And that's what I've done with this chart. So if we say this is March 21st, the beginning of the solar year, and we divide this circle into 365 days, the Earth going around the sun is what it is, then we find out what day you're born on, and we could read right off this chart what your keynote is. It's that simple. And then we can do the same thing with all the planets. Where were they in relation to the sun when the person was born? Because that configuration of the planets is, an exemplification, is the universal forces at that time. Because they wouldn't be where they are unless the universal forces put them there. So they're obeying natural law just like everything else. So they're going to be where they're supposed to be. So we can go back and take a snapshot of those forces using this as a key, that the musical notes as they evolve from keys. And it's a very complicated, it's not that it's complicated, it's that it takes a lot of insight to understand the evolution of music through keys. I haven't yet understood that. But I see the process. It goes up 5 steps and comes down 4 steps, something like that. And then the keys evolve one from another. And it's a natural thing. This is the natural way sound and music progresses. Getting back to a question someone was going to ask me is part of this thing, too. Natural music is not the same thing as artificial music, what we hear every day on the radio. Natural tones will evolve into subharmonics and superharmonics as shown somewhat as we've shown on this chart. They will naturally create these tones. If you sound this tone, these all sound at the same time. I mean, it's instant, they're there. Maybe we can't hear them, but they're still there. They're always there. I just lost my thought. When we sound a keynote, as you're born on a given day, you're going to have that keynote. Let's say you're born March 22nd, to kind of make it easy. Key of C is the first note that has evolved from this natural process. So we have the numbers and the frequencies will naturally correlate with each other. They naturally evolve from it. It's a natural thing. It's kind of like the Fibonacci series, which is musical, by the way, versus man-made music, which they got together, I think it was 1934 or 24, and they says the note A ought to be 440 cycles per second. Because from that number we can tune all the other instruments, and every music written in every country can be played on every instrument in every country, and it all sounds good. Well, that's the key right there. That's where it falls apart. It sounds good. Nature doesn't care one whit what we think. It sounds good, it sounds bad, it don't care. Nature is natural, and it will do what nature will do. When we create artificial ideas about what we think is good, and you know, we start stumbling along the way, and that's what's happened. Part of what's happened.
Does nature have a tuning mechanism? Like, how would you start your basses? What would be a natural sound that you could start for, say, a bass note? And the other question is that why the human voice potentially is more harmonic and easier on the ears, easier on the body for tuning than... Anyway, the first question, is there anything in nature that will give you a bass note rather than an instrument? Or is that a goofy question?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question.
Like 8 cycles per second of the Earth, or the waves, or...
I had that same question years ago, and I said, well, where do we start? What's the frequency, what's the benchmark frequency we can hang everything on? And there's only one. That's right there. You got to start with one. 1 cycle per second, 1 cycle per time interval. And then from that, through the natural mode that these things evolve into each other, you will get all this other stuff will fall out of it. You will all naturally fall out, naturally, sequentially. And that is your benchmark, is 1. And going back to the ancient metaphysical and mystical viewpoints of things, there is only one. One God, one force, one energy, one whatever. And everything else is a subset. The how and the why that takes place is what got me into this stuff, is trying to answer that. How and why. How did the void become materiality? So, what was the second part of your question?
I just thought of something else that I'd like to share with you that was on TV. A man was raising alligators. He had them in his basement, and he had them for years. and his wife, no one in the neighborhood knew. It was in a very quiet residential area. And his wife got into kind of a sewing group, and they had all these sewing machines. And she had the ladies over one afternoon, and they were all working their sewing machines. And the drone that started, the sound that was made by the sewing machine started the alligators in the basement roaring. Mm-hmm. And people wondered what was going on, and she explained it, that it was the pipes, you know, the water pipes in the basement. They were having a problem with their plumbing. Well, this went into a research project, and they were trying to figure out what note was it that started these alligators to do that. So they had a musician, and they thought, well, that particular note was, say, a B flat or something and they had a big tuba. And so they went out to, and this was all with the cameras. They were doing this live. They went to I think it was the Everglades or somewhere, where there was just infestations of alligators. So they were playing this note on the bridge, and there wasn't one sound. The alligators didn't make any noise. So they thought, well, gee, so much for that theory. But a man who happened to be standing on the bridge heard about this thing, and he said, well, why don't you recreate the environment? It was in a basement. It was, you know, there must have been sound waves bouncing off the wall. So they took the same experiment and went to a zoo where they had the cement walls and all these alligators around, and he played that same note. And lo and behold, all of them started this tremendous sound, and it was resonating the same note as the musical instrument. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, this had nothing to do with it, but it was just...
Oh, yes, it does. Actually, it does. It's a very good analogy. You know, if we all resonate to those fundamental tones that we're in tune with. You know, whatever our fundamental tone is. Mine happens to be D flat. And that manifests in many different ways. For instance, in color, it's kind of an off red, kind of towards the orange colors. And when I first determined this, I said, well, I didn't like that. You know, I like blue. I always bought everything blue. And I said, well, I got to verify or live my research if I'm going to talk to other people. And so I started buying clothes that color, and bought a car that color, and I started associating with that color. And very quickly I began to see that really was my color, not the blue. See, my artificial self liked blue, but my inner self resonated to this other color. So if we can learn these correspondences between the notes and the colors and all the other aspects of our lives and bring all these things into harmony, pretty soon, guess what? We can live in peace and harmony. We can begin to have a decent lifestyle instead of whatever. So you're right. People and items resonate to certain keynotes or fundamental tones. And it behooves everyone to find out what those are and adapt it. Question over here.
Does this tone have anything to do with the pitch of ringing that you will hear in your ears? And if so, why does that sometimes fluctuate up and down at certain moments?
I don't know if I can answer that. I haven't studied the ear like I wish I had time to do. There is a gentleman in Washington State somewhere who's doing that research, and he thinks that that's true, that the canal in the ear is a reflection of the tones of the body. Of course, it has to be. There has to be a concordance with every aspect of your body with your fundamental tone, or your body would start to come apart. And that is what disease is discord. So when your body and all the systems and organs begin to get in discord with each other, yeah, that's disease. That's right there. So you bring it all into harmony. So, yeah, and the pitch of your voice and all these things like Sherry Edwards does, they're all part and parcel of the whole thing. We are a whole organism in every aspect. In every aspect has to maintain a relationship, as we talked about the relativity of musical tones. Those vibrations have to be relative one to another. To give you a perfect example of this, I had this little theory in the back of my mind about this relativity business. And I ran into an article in the Sound and Vibration magazine. It's a technical magazine. An engineer had taken a plate, a square metal plate, and vibrated it like I was answering on this other question, to where it began to resonate. So he found the resonant frequencies of this plate, and he listed 4 or 5 or 6 of these frequencies. which he called modes, vibration modes of this plate. And this article, I've been looking for this article for a long time. Here's an engineer, not associated with myself, did this very empirical, very accurate, very precise analysis of this wave plate, a vibrating metal plate. And he had this list of frequencies. And these frequencies didn't have any relationship at all one to another, like we did here, very simply shown how they relate using simple numbers. But I had a little computer program I had been working on for a long time, and I ran those frequencies that he had through the computer program. And every single frequency he found formed a musical interval with the other frequencies, with some other frequency of that set. And they were within 1/100th of a frequency to be an exact musical interval. And that's enough preciseness in any engineering thing to say this is exact, this is what's going on. It was really marvelous that here is a metal plate that wasn't designed to be any kind of musical instrument, and all it puts out is musical intervals. Well, engineers are taught to read the harmonics. They are never taught about the partials that form between the harmonics, as in the 7 musical notes. They're taught to look at the first note and the 8th note, but never the other ones. So they're losing it all. They just don't have access to it. And this simple little experiment that he did and that I matched up with a little bit of arithmetic showed harmony in the midst of his chaos. So that's kind of the neat thing finding. Here we can find health by looking at it from a holistic viewpoint, where a doctor would find disease, which he can't treat because he doesn't know. He doesn't know. It's that simple. Question in the back.
I've been studying the case of Charlotte King, the lady who hears the earth before earthquakes. And duct walls vibration in a lot of buildings bother her, and that apparently is part of the sick building syndrome, is vibration of duct walls. And one thing she hears is 8 cycles per second, which she just said sets off the alligators. Have you seen photographs of the vibrations of the water dancing on the back of an alligator when it's roaring with that vibration?
I haven't seen that particular experiment.
It's dancing water is what you might call it.
Yeah. There is an experiment you can do at home, though. You can take a speaker, turn it up face up, put a pan of, like a cake pan, put just a little bit of water in this cake pan and turn your speaker on whatever sound source, could be a hi-fi or a microphone or whatever, and get the surface of this water to vibrating. It will form little spheres of water that will dance around on top of this water surface like you're talking about. It's really fascinating. And then you can empty your pan out and put other things like flour or lycopodium dust or whatever, and it is really extraordinary. It's kind of like Hans Jennings' tape where he shows these different substances vibrating. It's called visible sound. In the 1860s and 70s, they made all these little neat instruments where they could show sound by vibrating dust patterns.
I wanted to comment that Dr. Tomatis of Paris is an ear, nose, and throat specialist who sees the body as developing and around the ear, and it's the response to sound, and that's all I would say.
Yeah, there was, I think I met him at a conference in England. Okay. All right. And they were talking about treating cancer with vowel sounds. And they would sing these various tones, and he had a sequence of photographs where they showed this cancerous cell, or cell I guess it was, and it would start to oscillate with this tone. And the oscillation would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally it would just explode with pure sound. It's like disrupting water, same thing we were talking about earlier. Certain things, certain tones, resonant frequencies are extremely destructive. These things will add together. The amplitude of the vibrations will add together if the timing is done properly. That's what happens in that motor. You got soldiers walking across a bridge can destroy a perfectly good bridge. That's why they break step walking across bridges. It's the additive synthesis of the power causes these things to happen. Tremendous power can be built up. Any other questions?
I'd heard one explanation of the walls of Jericho coming down because of the harmonics from the trumpets and the shouts. Would that be?
Same thing. If they knew what the frequency of that wall was, they could bring it down, no trouble at all. Just like bringing a bridge down, or Tesla made an oscillator he slapped on the side of a building, caused an earthquake in downtown New York. Almost brought the building down, and just a little tiny little, weighed 2 or 3 pounds, I think it was. You just got it in sync with the vibration of that building, and it just built it up. It's like taking a bathtub full of water. You can push the water towards the end, and if you keep pushing it just right, that water will go right over the side, but at no time did you use that much force. You just added it to what you already did before. It's like a child on a swing. You get a real good swing like that. These new energy devices they're building nowadays are working, some of them are working on that principle. They get a potential and oscillate it back and forth, and they build up this energy. And you can build it up to incredible amounts of energy. And if you had a hole in the end of your bathtub and you've got this thing swinging back and forth, a little bit of water would shoot through that hole every time the wave struck it. Well, you do that with electrical circuits. You just oscillate it back and forth, and it crosses a bridge, and you get a spurt of energy. Well, you do that real quickly, and you can't tell that it's a broken flow. You get these same phenomena to happen. It's real simple. A lot of this stuff's real simple. It's not complicated at all. I want to show you this one thing. We just touched on this, called destruction with sound, or disintegration, acoustic disintegration. Okay. If we maintain the ratios 1 to 1 to 1 on the 3 modes of vibration, we're going to get a perfect sphere. If that's a molecule in the upper left-hand corner, it's all going to rotate perfectly in concordance and harmony. It'll be a nice sphere, and it really won't bother anybody. If we start elongating one of the orbits, we'll be introducing a discord to do that. According to what KELEA was saying, if the distance exceeded 1 to 4 in ratio, it would break apart. 1 to 4 in ratio. So going back to those photographs of that cell that this guy was oscillating with his voice, it would begin to oscillate, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it finally reached a point where it can't come back. It has to destroy itself, and it will come right apart. So that's the same thing. If we knew all the frequencies that were inherent in an atom, or a molecule in this case, we could take one of them, and if we had real precise timing, we could time it and add it together, just like we're doing in that motor right there. Add that little frequency together, it's going to come apart just like that. And at no time did you hit it with a big sledgehammer, or did you got a nuclear accelerator or whatever. But that's the principle behind the dissociation of water. You begin to expand the orbit by adding to its velocity of rotation to a point where it will finally break apart. And you can do that through this. If we look at this, if we showed all the musical notes in between these harmonics, we could see how music bridges the material realm to the infinite realm of mind and so-called God energies. Keshe said that over and over and over again. Music is the bridge. It's the only bridge that'll bridge gross materiality to the superfine, subtle, energetic forces. And it's the principles behind what makes music what it is, and that's what we were talking about all day today, is how vibrations add to each other, interact with each other, can become one, can become separate, in harmony or discord. And that's the nature of it. That's why I said in the beginning, the universe is musical. And it operates on the principle of sympathy, which is love. Any questions on that one? We'll look over this one another time. This is really important. This chart is so important. You see down the bottom, matter is bound up energy, and energy is liberated matter. It's 1893. It's 12 years before Einstein wrote his his theory on relativity, where he said energy equals mc squared. Well, that's what that says. These guys were working on this stuff years before conventional science began to even look at it. That's the same year that the electron was admitted to exist. You know, they were working on electricity in those days. They finally began to have electricity predominant in society, and they really didn't know what electricity was. There was a theory that this thing called electron had something to do with electricity, and they were all messing around with it. And I'm pretty sure it was Rutherford who finally got the credit for establishing the electron as a particle of electricity. Another thing, here's a really interesting thing. If it's true that the faster something goes, the denser it gets, the more energy it's got, and if what Keeley said was true about the ether, that it was 986,000 times denser than steel, you know, steel would be in here, or it'd be down in here someplace, because steel was carbon and iron. We get up here to the etheric realm. So this is almost 1,000,000 times denser than this realm down here. There's 1,000,000 times more energy here than here. That's why we got a lot more power in uranium than we have in chemicals like dynamite. So uranium is an interatomic force, or nuclear explosions are an interatomic force, versus dynamite, which is a molecular force. If it's true that that range of density exists there, then that means we are bubbles in the ether. It's exactly reverse of what we think it is. So we're not denser than the subtler forces. We are more tenuous than the subtler forces. And it's a hard thing to grasp, but the more you think about it, it's the only way it can be. And Asimov once wrote a book, I think it was on water. And I've been looking for that book for years, I haven't been able to find it. And he said, if ether was this, that, and the other thing, then it would have to be 400,000 times denser than steel. And it's absurd. He said that in his book. I remember that to this day. Well, let's put the absurdity aside. Let's put our own viewpoints aside, and let's look at it in a physical sense. If this chart has any accuracy to it at all, then that is true. And if that is true, then our physical organism, this lectern, the whole planet, is a bubble in this real, very dense media we call the ether. So you say, well, how can we move around then? Well, a bubble in water, an air bubble in water is less dense than the water, and it moves around the water. Doesn't have a whole lot of integrity, like, you know, but it does have its existence. Got 1 minute. Is there a quick question? Especially on this bubble stuff, how I can move around the bubble. The theory of how that works is we go from the fine etheric levels. We got that fine etheric point about which molecules, atoms, all vibrations can concentrate, can aggregate. They centralize these forces about this infinite center. Well, some guys theorize that this happens 4 billion times a second, 4 quadrillion times a second. So we come in and out of materiality 4 quadrillion times a second. And that's an astounding theory to think about. So if you want to know more about this and want to get more material, stop at my book table. We've got all kinds of stuff over there. We've got scrapbooks. You can see pictures and photographs. And I thoroughly enjoyed having spoken to you today. Thank you.
Thank you much.